by love and courage. Lady Cecily of Ravensshire had spent years at court, avoiding Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's most feared enforcer. But when he appeared at her side during a grand feast, his voice was a whisper of steel. "You are playing a dangerous game, Cecily," he murmured. "And I am the one sent to end it." Chapter 1. The Whispered Threat. The great hall of Castle Northwood blazed with light. Hundreds of candles, thick as a man's arm, cast a flickering glow upon the assembled nobility, their jewels glittering like captured stars against silks and velvets. The air hummed with the low thrum of conversation, the clatter of silverware against silver platters, and the occasional burst of laughter that punctuated the carefully constructed civility of court. Lady Cecily of Ravensshire, however, felt none of the warmth. She sat rigidly at the high table, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach, her fingers laced tightly in her lap beneath the heavy folds of her emerald green gown. The feast was in honor of King Edmund's name day, a lavish affair designed to display the power and wealth of the realm. Yet, Cecily felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air seeping through the thick stone walls. For years, she had navigated the treacherous currents of courtly life with a practiced grace, a carefully constructed facade of serene composure. She had learned to smile without showing her teeth, to speak without revealing her thoughts, to listen without truly hearing the insidious whispers that snaked through the corridors of power. But tonight, the mask felt brittle, threatening to crack. She had seen him the moment he entered the hall. Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's enforcer. A man whispered about in hushed tones, a figure cloaked in shadow and rumor. He was known as the King's Hound, relentless pursuer of those who dared to cross the monarch. His very presence was an ill omen, a harbinger of royal displeasure. And tonight, that displeasure, she feared, was directed at her. Cecily had deliberately chosen a seat far from the king's dais, hoping to remain unnoticed, a small, insignificant bird amidst a flock of preening peacocks. She had feigned illness for the past week, avoiding the usual gatherings, the endless rounds of gossip and intrigue. But the king's name-day feast was mandatory, an absence deemed an act of defiance. She picked at the roasted pheasant on her plate, the rich, savory scent doing nothing to tempt her appetite. Her gaze flickered across the hall, taking in the familiar faces, the practiced smiles, the veiled animosity. Lady Annalise, her closest confidant, sat 2 places down, her brow furrowed with concern. Annalise knew. She knew the precarious game Cecily was playing, the risks she was taking. A sudden hush fell over a section of the hall, a ripple of silence spreading outwards like a wave. Cecily's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, without looking, that he was approaching. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable tension. The scent of leather and steel, a scent she had come to associate with fear, reached her nostrils. He stopped beside her chair, a towering figure blocking out the light. Cecily forced herself to look up, to meet his gaze. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, cold and unforgiving, yet with a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. His face was hard, sculpted by years of war and hardship, a network of fine lines etched around his eyes and mouth. A scar, pale and jagged, traced a path across his left cheek, a silent testament to his brutal profession. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture devoid of courtesy. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stones beneath their feet. "Sir Nicholas," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. She kept her gaze fixed on his, refusing to show any sign of weakness. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, the movement sending a shiver of apprehension down her spine. The hall around them seemed to fade, the sounds and colors blurring into a hazy backdrop. It was as if they were alone, suspended in a bubble of impending doom. "You are playing a dangerous game, Cecily," he murmured, his voice a whisper of steel, each word laced with a chilling finality. "And I am the one sent to end it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Cecily felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chilling premonition of what was to come. She had known this moment might arrive, had anticipated it with a mixture of fear and defiance. But hearing the words spoken aloud by him brought the reality crashing down upon her with the force of a physical blow. She had been aiding her brother, Thomas, a man branded a traitor by the king for his outspoken criticism of the crown's heavy taxes and his advocacy for the rights of the common folk. Thomas had fled the kingdom, seeking refuge in the distant, independent lands of the north. Cecily, using her position at court, had been secretly sending him funds, information, anything that might help him survive. It was treason, punishable by death. She knew that, but loyalty to her family, to her brother, had outweighed the risk. She had believed she could keep her actions hidden, that her carefully constructed facade would protect her. She had been wrong. Sir Nicholas straightened, his gaze unwavering. The brief, intimate moment was over. He was once again the king's hound, the implacable enforcer. The noise of the feast returned, washing over her like a tidal wave. But the world had shifted. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, the future a dark and uncertain abyss. Annalise leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Cecily? What did he say?" Cecily forced a smile, a brittle, meaningless curve of her lips. "Nothing of consequence, my dear. Merely a greeting." But the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She knew that the game was over, and she had no idea how to escape the consequences. The king's warning had been delivered, clear and unmistakable. Her life, as she knew it, was about to unravel. The fear was a cold, hard knot in her chest, but beneath it, a flicker of defiance remained. She would not surrender easily. She would fight, even if it was a losing battle. She owed that much to her brother, to herself. But the odds were stacked against her, and the king's hound was at her heels. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The days following the king's name day feast were a blur of strained smiles and forced pleasantries. Cecily moved through the court like a ghost, haunted by Sir Nicholas Warwick's whispered threat. Sleep offered little respite. Her nights were plagued by restless dreams, visions of dark figures, and whispered accusations. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of tapestry, sent shivers of apprehension down her spine. She felt his eyes on her constantly, a silent, watchful presence that made her skin crawl. She had tried to reach out to her brother, Thomas, sending a coded message through a trusted merchant who frequented the northern trade routes. But she had received no reply. The silence was deafening, amplifying her fears. Had he been captured? Had her message been intercepted? The uncertainty was a torment, a slow, agonizing drip of dread. One crisp autumn morning, Cecily sought refuge in the castle gardens. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The vibrant colors of summer had faded, replaced by the muted hues of autumn russet, gold, and deep brown. The garden, usually a place of solace, offered little comfort now. The beauty felt stark, almost mocking, against the backdrop of her inner turmoil. She sat on a stone bench beside a fountain, the gentle splashing of water a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within her. She closed her eyes, trying to recapture a sense of calm, a moment of peace. But the image of Sir Nicholas's face, his cold, assessing gaze, intruded upon her thoughts. She had known him, distantly, since childhood. He had been a page in her father's household, a quiet, serious boy who excelled in all things martial. Even then, there had been an aura of intensity about him, a sense of unwavering purpose that set him apart from the other boys. He had risen quickly through the ranks, his skill with a sword and his unwavering loyalty to the king earning him a place of prominence. Cecily had always been wary of him, sensing a darkness beneath his stoic exterior. He was a man of few words, his emotions tightly controlled, his true nature hidden behind a wall of iron discipline. He was the antithesis of her brother, Thomas, who was all fiery passion and impulsive pronouncements. She opened her eyes, gazing at the intricate carvings on the fountain. A depiction of a falcon, the symbol of the royal house, clutching a dove in its talons. A fitting metaphor for her current predicament, she thought bitterly. She was the dove, trapped and helpless, at the mercy of the powerful falcon. A rustle of leaves behind her made her turn. Sir Nicholas stood there, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the garden path. He was dressed in his usual attire, dark leather jerkin, sturdy boots, and a sword strapped to his hip. He looked more like a warrior than a courtier, a man more at home on the battlefield than in the gilded halls of the castle. He approached her slowly, his steps measured and deliberate. Cecily rose to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt a primal urge to flee, to escape his presence, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. He did not offer a greeting, nor did he address her with any pretense of courtesy. "Sir Nicholas," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on her. "I have been watching you," he said, his voice low and steady. "Observing your movements, your interactions." Cecily felt a chill run down her spine. She knew he was not merely stating a fact, he was issuing a warning. "I am aware of your correspondence," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your attempts to communicate with your brother." Cecily's breath caught in her throat. She had been so careful, so discreet. How had he discovered her secret? "I have intercepted your messages," he said, confirming her worst fears. "Your attempts to aid a traitor are unwise, to say the least." Cecily felt a surge of anger, a desperate defiance against the inevitable. "My brother is not a traitor," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He is a good man, a loyal subject who dared to speak truth to power." Sir Nicholas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "Truth? Or sedition? The line is often blurred, Lady Cecily." "He seeks only justice," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "Fairness for the people, relief from the king's oppressive taxes." "The king's taxes are necessary to maintain the realm," Sir Nicholas countered, his voice calm and unwavering. "To defend it against its enemies." "And to line the pockets of the nobility," Cecily retorted, her anger overriding her fear. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but she could not hold back the words. Sir Nicholas's expression hardened. "You speak treason, Lady Cecily. Be careful." "I speak the truth," she insisted, her voice shaking. "A truth that you, the king's loyal hound, are too blind to see." He took a step closer, his presence looming over her. Cecily felt a tremor of fear, but she refused to back down. "Loyalty is not blindness, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice low and intense. "It is a choice, a commitment. And I have made my choice." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "You have a choice to make as well, Lady Cecily. A choice between loyalty to your family and loyalty to your king. Choose wisely." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, trembling and alone. His words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the precariousness of her situation. She had made her choice, years ago, when she had first decided to help her brother. But now, facing the consequences, she wondered if she had made the right one. The shadows of the past, the weight of her family's history, pressed down upon her, threatening to suffocate her. She was trapped, caught between her loyalty to her brother and the implacable power of the king. And Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's enforcer, was the instrument of her potential downfall. Chapter 3. The Falcon and the Dove. The following days were marked by a subtle, yet palpable shift in Cecily's status at court. Whispers followed her, glances were averted, and conversations ceased abruptly when she approached. She was becoming a pariah, a dangerous presence to be avoided. Even Lady Annalise, her steadfast friend, seemed hesitant, her usual warmth replaced by a cautious reserve. Cecily understood. Annalise had her own position to protect, her own family to consider. Loyalty had its limits. Cecily found herself increasingly isolated, spending her days in the quieter corners of the castle, the library, the chapel, the neglected sections of the gardens. She sought solace in books, in prayer, in the simple act of observing the changing seasons. But even these small comforts were tainted by the ever-present threat that hung over her. One afternoon, she was sitting in the library, poring over an ancient illuminated manuscript, when Sir Nicholas entered. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the tall, narrow windows that overlooked the castle courtyard. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and dust. Cecily looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. She had not heard him approach. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator stalking its prey. He stopped before her, his gaze sweeping over the open book on the table. "The Historia Regum Britanniae," he said, his voice a low murmur. "A tale of kings and queens, of battles and betrayals." Cecily closed the book, her heart pounding against her ribs. "It is a history of our realm," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He nodded. "Indeed. A history filled with lessons for those who would learn them." He leaned against a nearby bookshelf, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. Cecily felt a sense of unease, a feeling of being trapped, scrutinized. "Do you find such tales instructive, Lady Cecily?" he asked, his voice laced with a subtle challenge. "I find them interesting," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "They remind us that power is fleeting, that even the mightiest kings can fall." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "And that loyalty is often rewarded, while treachery is punished." Cecily met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Loyalty is not always a virtue, Sir Nicholas. Sometimes it is a blindfold, preventing us from seeing the truth." "And what truth is that, Lady Cecily?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "The truth that justice is more important than blind obedience," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "That the needs of the many outweigh the desires of the few." He was silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. Cecily felt a strange connection to him, a fleeting moment of understanding that transcended their opposing positions. "You speak with the passion of your brother," he said, his voice devoid of accusation. Cecily felt a pang of sadness, a longing for Thomas, for his unwavering belief in a better world. "He is a good man, Sir Nicholas. He only wants what is best for the people." "And you believe that his methods are justified?" he asked, his voice still neutral. "I believe that sometimes desperate measures are necessary," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "When all other avenues are closed." He nodded slowly. "A dangerous philosophy, Lady Cecily. One that can lead to chaos and destruction." He pushed himself away from the bookshelf, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked towards the window, gazing out at the courtyard below. "The king believes in order," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "In stability. He believes that a strong hand is necessary to keep the realm from descending into anarchy." Cecily watched him, her mind racing. She wondered if he was truly as unyielding as he appeared, if there was any room for compromise, for understanding. "And what do you believe, Sir Nicholas?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. He turned back to her, his gaze piercing. "I believe in duty," he said, his voice firm. "In loyalty to my king, to my oath." "And what about justice?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a slight shrug, a gesture that seemed to dismiss the question as irrelevant. "Justice is the king's prerogative, Lady Cecily, not mine." He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. Cecily felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had hoped, foolishly, that she might find some common ground with him, some way to bridge the chasm that separated them. But it was clear that he was as unyielding as the king he served. He was the falcon and she was the dove, and there could be no peace between them. The encounter left her feeling more vulnerable than ever, the weight of her secret pressing down on her with renewed force. Chapter 4. A Night's Scrutiny. The following week, Sir Nicholas summoned Cecily to his private chambers. It was an unusual request, one that sent a wave of apprehension through her. Court protocol dictated that such meetings should take place in a more formal setting, witnessed by others. His deviation from the norm suggested a change in tactics, a more direct approach. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue velvet, simple yet elegant. She wore no jewelry, save for a small silver locket containing a miniature portrait of her brother, hidden beneath the fabric of her dress. It was a talisman, a reminder of the bond that fueled her defiance. His chambers were located in the older section of the castle, a stark contrast to the opulent apartments of the royal family. The room was sparsely furnished, with a large desk, a few chairs, and a weapons rack displaying an assortment of swords, axes, and shields. The walls were bare stone, devoid of tapestries or ornamentation. The only source of light came from a single window and a fire crackling in the hearth. He was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her. He turned as she approached, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice neutral. He gestured towards a chair opposite his desk. "Please sit." Cecily sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a knot of tension in her stomach, a sense of impending doom. He sat down opposite her, his gaze fixed on her. He did not speak for a long moment, his silence amplifying the tension in the room. "I've been reviewing the evidence against your brother," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "The accusations of treason, of inciting rebellion." Cecily's heart pounded against her ribs. She had known this moment would come, but she was still unprepared for the weight of his words. "The evidence is compelling," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Witness testimonies, intercepted letters, financial records." Cecily felt a surge of despair. She had been so careful, so discreet. How had he gathered so much information? "I have also been investigating your involvement," he said, his voice laced with a subtle emphasis. "Your role in aiding and abetting a traitor." Cecily's breath caught in her throat. She knew she could not deny the truth. He had her cornered. I have done nothing wrong," she stammered, her voice trembling. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You have aided a traitor, Lady Cecily. That is a serious offense, punishable by death." Cecily felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She had known the risks, but hearing them spoken aloud, by him, brought the reality crashing down upon her. "My brother is innocent," she insisted, her voice desperate. "He is a victim of the king's tyranny." Sir Nicholas leaned forward, his gaze intense. "The king is not a tyrant, Lady Cecily. He is a ruler, charged with maintaining order and stability in the realm." "At what cost?" she retorted, her anger flaring. "At the cost of justice? Of fairness?" "Order is paramount," he replied, his voice firm. "Without order, there is chaos. And chaos breeds destruction." "And what about compassion?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about mercy?" He was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he gave a slight shrug, a gesture that seemed to dismiss the question as irrelevant. "Those are luxuries, Lady Cecily. Luxuries that a ruler cannot always afford." He reached for a stack of papers on his desk, shuffling through them. Cecily watched him, her mind racing. She wondered what he was planning, what his next move would be. "I have here a confession," he said, his voice low and steady. "A document detailing your brother's crimes and your complicity." He held up a sheet of parchment, the ink still wet. Cecily's eyes widened in horror. "It was a forgery, a fabrication. All that is required is your signature," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "A confession of your guilt, and a plea for the king's mercy." Cecily stared at the document, her mind reeling. It was a trap, a way to force her to betray her brother, to condemn herself. I cannot," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "You can," he insisted, his voice firm. "It is the only way to save yourself." "And betray my brother?" she retorted, her voice rising slightly. "Never." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze assessing. "You are a stubborn woman, Lady Cecily." "I am a loyal sister," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he surprised her. He reached for a candle on his desk, holding the confession over the flame. The parchment caught fire, the edges curling and blackening. Cecily watched, stunned, as the document burned, turning to ashes. He had destroyed the evidence, the proof of her guilt.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely audible. He looked at her, his gaze intense. Because I believe you, he said, his voice low and steady. I believe that you are not a traitor. That you acted out of loyalty, out of love for your brother. Cecily felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of confusion. She did not understand. He was the king's enforcer, the man tasked with rooting out treason. Why was he helping her? He rose from his chair, walking towards the window. But the king, he will not be so easily convinced. He is a man who values proof and punishment. He paused, his gaze fixed outside on the gathering dusk. And the evidence, while circumstantial, is not entirely without merit. He turned to face her once again, the firelight casting shadows on his face, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw and the intensity in his eyes. I can protect you, Cecily, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But you must trust me. You must do as I say. The weight of his words, the unexpected offer of protection, left her breathless, caught between hope and a deep, abiding fear. Chapter 5. The Tournament of Secrets. King Edmund decreed a tournament, a grand spectacle of martial prowess and courtly display. Ostensibly, it was to celebrate the recent victory over a rebellious northern lord, but Cecily suspected it was also a way to flesh out dissent, to identify those who might be wavering in their loyalty. The tournament was a stage, and everyone at court was an actor, playing their assigned roles. The air crackled with anticipation. Knights from across the realm gathered, their armor gleaming, their banners snapping in the wind. The sounds of clashing steel, thundering hooves, and cheering crowds filled the air. Cecily, however, felt a sense of dread, a premonition of danger. Sir Nicholas had instructed her to attend the tournament, to act as if nothing were amiss. He had warned her to be careful, to watch her words and actions, to avoid drawing attention to herself. He had also told her, in a hushed voice, that he was working to clear her brother's name, to find the real culprits behind the unrest in the north. It was a dangerous game he was playing, risking his own position, his own life, to help her. She watched the jousting from the royal box, seated beside Lady Annalise, who had cautiously resumed their friendship, sensing a shift in Cecily's fortunes. Annalise chattered about the knights, their lineage, their reputations, but Cecily barely heard her. Her gaze was fixed on Sir Nicholas, who was participating in the tournament, representing the king. He was a formidable warrior, his skill with a lance and sword unmatched. He unseated opponent after opponent, his movements precise and powerful, his face a mask of concentration. He fought with a cold, controlled fury, a silent intensity that both impressed and frightened her. During a lull in the jousting, a young knight, Sir Gareth of Eldoria, approached Cecily. He was a handsome man, with a charming smile and a reputation for bravery. He had been paying her subtle attention in recent weeks, a courtship that Cecily had largely ignored. Lady Cecily, he said, bowing low. You look radiant today. Cecily forced a smile. Thank you, Sir Gareth. He lingered, engaging her in polite conversation, his eyes full of admiration. Cecily responded mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She was aware of Sir Nicholas watching them from across the field, his expression unreadable. Suddenly, Sir Gareth leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I have heard rumors, Lady Cecily, he said, his eyes searching hers. Rumors about your brother, about your involvement. Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She felt a surge of panic. How much did he know? Was he a friend or a foe? I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice trembling. He smiled, a knowing smile that chilled her to the bone. I think you do, Lady Cecily. And I believe I can help you. He slipped a small, folded piece of parchment into her hand. Read this, he whispered. It contains information that could save you both. He bowed again and walked away, leaving Cecily stunned and confused. She glanced at the parchment, her hands trembling. It was sealed with a crest she did not recognize. She looked across the field at Sir Nicholas, her eyes pleading for guidance. He met her gaze, his expression hardening. He gave a slight nod, a silent command to be cautious. Later that evening, after the tournament had concluded, Cecily found herself alone in her chambers. She opened the parchment, her heart pounding against her ribs. The message was brief, written in a hurried hand. Your brother is in danger. He is being framed by Lord Ashford, who seeks to seize his lands. Meet me at the old chapel tomorrow at midnight. I have proof. Cecily gasped. Lord Ashford was a powerful nobleman, a close advisor to the king. He was also a known enemy of her family, a man who had long coveted their ancestral lands. The message was unsigned, but Cecily suspected it was from Sir Gareth. He had seemed genuinely concerned, his offer of help sincere. But could she trust him? Was it a trap? She paced her chambers, her mind racing. She had to do something, but she was afraid of making the wrong decision. She thought of Sir Nicholas, of his promise to protect her. She longed to confide in him, to seek his advice, but she was afraid of jeopardizing his efforts, of putting him in danger. She decided to take a risk. She would meet Sir Gareth at the old chapel, but she would be careful. She would bring a weapon, and she would be prepared to defend herself. It was a dangerous gamble, but she had no other choice. Her brother's life, and her own, were at stake. As the moon climbed high in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the castle grounds, Cecily knew that the tournament of secrets was far from over. And she was a player, whether she liked it or not. Chapter 6. Beneath the Banners of War. The old chapel stood on the outskirts of the castle grounds, a crumbling ruin hidden amongst a grove of ancient yew trees. It had been abandoned for decades, its stones weathered and overgrown with ivy, its roof partially collapsed. It was a place of shadows and whispers, a fitting location for a clandestine meeting. Cecily arrived just before midnight, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was dressed in a dark cloak, her face hidden by a hood. She carried a small dagger, concealed beneath the folds of her cloak. The air was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the hooting of an owl. She waited, her senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to carry a threat. She was acutely aware of her vulnerability, of the danger she was in. A figure emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by the shadows. Cecily's hand tightened around the hilt of her dagger. Lady Cecily? A voice whispered. It was Sir Gareth. Cecily let out a sigh of relief, but her apprehension remained. Sir Gareth, she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He approached her, his steps cautious. You came, he said, his voice low and earnest. I was afraid you wouldn't trust me. I am still unsure, Cecily admitted, her gaze searching his. But I am desperate to help my brother. He nodded. I understand. And I can help you. I have proof of Lord Ashford's treachery. He reached into his tunic, pulling out a small, leather-bound pouch. This contains letters, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Letters written by Lord Ashford to his allies, outlining his plans to frame your brother and seize his lands. Cecily's eyes widened. This was the evidence she needed, the proof that could clear Thomas's name. How did you obtain these? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. I have sources, he replied, his gaze evasive. Loyal men who are disgusted by Ashford's treachery. He handed her the pouch. Cecily took it, her hands trembling. She opened it, pulling out a stack of parchment. The letters were indeed written in Lord Ashford's hand, his signature bold and unmistakable. This is incredible, she whispered, her voice filled with awe and relief. This could save my brother. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind them. Cecily whirled around, her hand flying to her dagger. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their swords drawn. They were Lord Ashford's men, recognizable by their livery. Cecily's heart sank. It was a trap. Sir Gareth had betrayed her. I am sorry, Lady Cecily, Sir Gareth said, his voice filled with false regret. But I had no choice. Lord Ashford is too powerful. He stepped aside, revealing Lord Ashford himself, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Well done, Sir Gareth, Lord Ashford said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You have delivered the traitor into my hands. Cecily stood her ground, her eyes blazing with defiance. She was surrounded, outnumbered, but she would not surrender. You are a coward, Ashford, she spat, her voice filled with contempt. A snake who preys on the weak. Lord Ashford chuckled. Brave words, Lady Cecily. But they will not save you. You and your brother will pay the price for your treason. He signaled to his men. They advanced, their swords glinting in the moonlight. Cecily prepared to fight, knowing that it was a hopeless battle. Suddenly, a figure leaped from the shadows, a whirlwind of steel and fury. It was Sir Nicholas Warwick. He moved with lightning speed, his sword a blur of motion. He engaged Ashford's men, his skill unmatched. He fought with a cold, controlled rage, a silent intensity that terrified his opponents. Cecily watched, stunned, as he cut down man after man. He was a force of nature, a one-man army. He had come to save her, risking his own life to protect her. Lord Ashford, seeing his men falling, turned to flee. But Sir Nicholas was too quick. He intercepted him, his sword at Ashford's throat. Yield, Ashford, Sir Nicholas said, his voice a low growl.
Or die.
Ashford, his face pale with terror, dropped his sword. He was defeated, his treachery exposed. Sir Nicholas turned to Cecily, his gaze intense. Are you unharmed? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Yes, she replied, her voice trembling. Thank you. You saved my life. He nodded, his expression softening slightly. I told you I would protect you. He turned back to Ashford, his face hardening. You will answer for your crimes, Ashford. You will confess to the king, and you will clear Thomas of Ravenshire's name. Ashford, defeated and humiliated, could only nod. The tables had turned. The hunter had become the hunted. Beneath the banners of a conflict far greater than a simple tournament, Cecily had witnessed true courage and unwavering loyalty, not just from Sir Nicholas, but also in herself. The night was a turning point, a moment of truth that had exposed the treachery of some and the unwavering devotion of others. And as the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Cecily knew that the fight was far from over, but she was no longer alone. She had an ally, a protector, a man who had defied expectations and risked everything to save her. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Cloister. The aftermath of the confrontation at the old chapel sent ripples through the court. Lord Ashford's arrest and confession shocked the nobility, his swift downfall a testament to Sir Nicholas's influence and the king's surprisingly swift justice. Thomas's name was cleared, although he remained in exile, awaiting a formal pardon from the king. Cecily, however, was still under a cloud of suspicion, her involvement in aiding her brother known to many, even if her actions were now seen in a more sympathetic light. Sir Nicholas, having openly defied a powerful lord and protected Cecily, found himself in a precarious position. He had made enemies, powerful enemies who resented his interference and questioned his motives. He walked a tightrope, balancing his loyalty to the king with his growing commitment to Cecily. Cecily, seeking solace and guidance, retreated to a nearby monastery, a place of quiet contemplation and spiritual refuge. The monastery was renowned for its library and its wise abbess, Mother Alara, a woman known for her sharp intellect and her compassionate heart. The monastery was a world apart from the court, a sanctuary of peace and tranquility. The monks and nuns lived a simple life, devoted to prayer, study, and manual labor. The days were structured around the canonical hours, the chanting of prayers echoing through the cloisters. Cecily found comfort in the rhythm of monastic life, in the quiet contemplation, in the absence of courtly intrigue. She spent her days reading, praying, and talking with Mother Alara. Mother Alara was an elderly woman, her face lined with wisdom and kindness, her eyes bright and perceptive. She listened patiently to Cecily's story, her silence more comforting than any words. "You have been through much, my child," Mother Alara said finally, her voice soft and gentle. "You have faced danger and betrayal, and you have emerged stronger." Cecily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "But I am still afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Afraid of what the future holds, afraid of the enemies I have made." Mother Alara smiled. "Fear is a natural emotion, my child. It is a part of being human. But fear should not control you. It should not paralyze you. But how do I overcome it?" Cecily asked, her voice pleading. "By faith," Mother Alara replied, her voice firm. "By trusting in something greater than yourself. By believing in the power of good, in the ultimate triumph of justice." She paused, her gaze searching Cecily's. "And by trusting in those who have proven themselves worthy of your trust," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Cecily understood. Mother Alara was referring to Sir Nicholas. She had seen the way he had protected Cecily, the risks he had taken. She had sensed the connection between them, a bond that transcended duty and loyalty. One afternoon, while Cecily was working in the monastery's herb garden, she received a message. Sir Nicholas had arrived, requesting to see her. Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She had not seen him since the night at the old chapel. She had longed to thank him, to speak with him, but she had been afraid of complicating his already precarious situation. She met him in the monastery's guest parlor, a simple room with bare walls and a few wooden chairs. He was dressed in his usual attire, dark leather jerkin and sturdy boots, but he looked weary, his face lined with fatigue. "Lady Cecily," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all, Sir Nicholas," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I am grateful for your visit." He gestured towards a chair. "Please sit." They sat down opposite each other, a silence falling between them. Cecily felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, relief, and a growing sense of unease. "I have come to update you," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "On your brother's situation and on other matters." "My brother?" Cecily asked, her voice filled with hope. "The king has agreed to grant him a full pardon," Sir Nicholas replied, his gaze meeting hers. "He will be allowed to return to Ravensshire." Cecily felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense that she almost wept. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything you have done." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It was the right thing to do." He paused, his gaze shifting away. "But there are complications," he continued, his voice becoming more hesitant. "Lord Ashford's allies are unhappy. They are seeking to undermine the king's decision, to discredit me." Cecily's heart sank. She had known that this victory would not come without a price. "What can be done?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "I will need your help," he said, his voice low and steady. "I will need your testimony, your support." He was asking her to step back into the dangerous world of court intrigue, to risk everything again. But she could not refuse him. He had saved her life, her brother's life. She owed him everything. The whispers in the cloister had revealed not just the plots of enemies, but the quiet strength of a bond forged in danger and sealed by mutual trust. As they prepared to face the challenges ahead, Cecily knew that their alliance was more than just a matter of survival. It was a testament to the enduring power of hope and the unexpected blossoming of something deeper, something that resembled the first fragile blooms of spring after a long, harsh winter. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. Returning to court was like stepping back into a viper's nest. Cecily felt the eyes of the courtiers upon her, their whispers following her like shadows. Lord Ashford's allies, though subdued, were still a force to be reckoned with, their resentment simmering beneath a veneer of civility. They saw Cecily as a symbol of their defeat, a reminder of Sir Nicholas's defiance. The king, though he had pardoned Thomas, remained wary of Cecily. He valued loyalty above all else, and her past actions, however justified, had cast a shadow of doubt upon her. He treated her with a cool formality, a distance that emphasized her precarious position. Sir Nicholas, however, remained steadfast in his support. He publicly defended Cecily, praising her courage and her loyalty to her family. He made it clear that he would not tolerate any further attacks against her, either overt or covert. His protection was a shield, but it also made her a target. The tension at court was palpable, a constant undercurrent of suspicion and intrigue. Cecily found herself isolated once again, her only allies Sir Nicholas and a handful of others who dared to defy the prevailing sentiment. Annalise, though still cautious, offered her quiet support, their friendship rekindled by shared adversity. One evening, Cecily was summoned to the king's private chambers. She entered with trepidation, her heart pounding against her ribs. The king was seated at his desk, his expression grim. Sir Nicholas was standing beside him, his face a mask of stoicism. "Lady Cecily," the king said, his voice cold and formal. "You are aware of the controversy surrounding your brother's pardon." Cecily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, your majesty. There are those who believe that you do not deserve such leniency," the king continued, his gaze piercing. "That your actions, however motivated by familial loyalty, were still treasonous." Cecily felt a surge of despair. She had hoped that the matter was settled, that she could finally put the past behind her. But it seemed that her enemies were relentless. "I have always been loyal to the crown, your majesty," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I acted out of love for my brother, but I never intended to harm the realm." The king was silent for a moment, his gaze assessing. "Sir Nicholas has spoken in your defense," he said finally. "He believes in your innocence, in your loyalty." Cecily glanced at Sir Nicholas, her heart filled with gratitude. He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "However," the king continued, his voice hardening, "loyalty must be proven, not merely claimed." He paused, his gaze shifting to a small, ornate box on his desk. "I have a task for you, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice laced with a subtle challenge. "A task that will demonstrate your loyalty, your commitment to the crown." He opened the box, revealing a single, glittering jewel, a large ruby, set in a gold pendant. It was the king's seal, a symbol of his authority, a priceless artifact. "I am entrusting you with this," the king said, his voice low and steady. "You will guard it with your life. You will keep it safe from those who would seek to steal it, to use it against me." Cecily's eyes widened in disbelief. The king was testing her, putting her in a position of immense responsibility, immense danger. "Your majesty," she stammered, her voice filled with uncertainty. "This is not a request, Lady Cecily," the king said, his voice firm. "It is a command. Your loyalty, your future depend on it." Cecily knew that she had no choice. She had to accept the task, to prove her loyalty, even if it meant risking her life. She reached for the pendant, her hand trembling. The ruby felt cold against her skin, a weight of responsibility settling upon her. "I will not fail you, your majesty," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The king nodded, his expression unreadable. "See that you do not." Sir Nicholas stepped forward, his gaze intense. "I will assist Lady Cecily in this matter, your majesty," he said, his voice firm. "I will ensure her safety and the safety of the seal." The king gave a slight nod of approval. "Very well. You are both dismissed." Cecily and Sir Nicholas left the king's chambers, the weight of their new responsibility heavy upon them. They were bound together by this task, their fates intertwined. The price of loyalty was high, and Cecily was prepared to pay it. But she knew that she was not alone. She had Sir Nicholas by her side, a man who had proven his loyalty, his courage, and his unwavering commitment to her. And as they faced the dangers ahead, she found strength in his presence, in his unwavering support. The jewel was a symbol, not just of the king's power, but of the trust, fragile yet growing, between them. Chapter 9. A Dance of Deception. The king's seal became Cecily's constant companion, a heavy weight around her neck, both literally and figuratively. She wore it hidden beneath her gown, its presence a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried, the danger she faced. She trusted no one, suspecting everyone. The court was a labyrinth of secrets and lies, and she was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from disaster. Sir Nicholas was her shadow, her protector. He was always near, his presence a reassuring constant in a world of uncertainty. He watched over her, guarding her from those who would seek to harm her, to steal the seal. He was her confidant, her advisor, the one person she could truly trust. They developed a subtle code, a way of communicating without words, a language of glances and gestures. They had to be careful, for they were constantly being watched, their every move scrutinized. The court was a stage, and they were playing their roles, concealing their true feelings, their true intentions. One evening, a grand ball was held at the castle. It was a lavish affair, designed to impress foreign dignitaries and to showcase the power and wealth of the realm. Cecily dreaded the event, knowing that it would be a breeding ground for intrigue, a place where her enemies would be watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep crimson silk, embroidered with gold thread. She wore no jewelry, save for a small, silver bracelet, a gift from Sir Nicholas. The king's seal was hidden beneath her gown, its presence a constant weight against her heart. Sir Nicholas escorted her to the ball, his hand resting lightly on her arm, a gesture of protection and reassurance. He was dressed in his finest attire, a black velvet doublet and hose, his sword strapped to his hip. He looked every inch the noble knight, the king's loyal champion. The ballroom was a dazzling spectacle of light and color. The walls were adorned with tapestries and banners, the floor polished to a mirror sheen. The air was filled with the music of lutes and viols, the scent of perfume and roasted meats. The courtiers, dressed in their finest silks and velvets, danced and mingled, their conversations a mixture of polite banter and veiled threats. Cecily and Sir Nicholas danced together, their movements graceful and synchronized. They spoke little, their eyes doing most of the talking. They were aware of the eyes upon them, the whispers that followed them. They were playing a dangerous game, a dance of deception. During a pause in the dancing, a group of courtiers approached them. They were Lord Ashford's allies, their faces masks of polite civility, their eyes filled with resentment. "Lady Cecily," one of them said, bowing low, "you look radiant tonight." Cecily forced a smile. "Thank you, my lord. We were just discussing the remarkable recovery of your brother's fortunes," another said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Such a swift turn of events. Cecily felt a surge of anger, but she kept her composure. "Justice was served," she replied, her voice steady. "Indeed," a third said, his gaze fixed on her. "But some might say that justice was influenced." Cecily knew what they were implying. They were accusing Sir Nicholas of using his position to favor her, to manipulate the king. Sir Nicholas stepped forward, his voice cold and firm. "Lady Cecily's brother was innocent," he said, his gaze sweeping over the group. The evidence was clear. Lord Ashford's treachery was exposed. "Of course," one of them said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We would not dare to question your integrity, Sir Nicholas." The tension in the air was palpable. Cecily felt a sense of dread, a premonition of danger. These men were her enemies, and they were looking for any opportunity to discredit her, to harm her. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance to the ballroom. A group of guards were struggling with a man, who was shouting and protesting. It was a messenger, bearing a sealed letter. The messenger broke free from the guards and ran towards the king, who was seated on a raised dais at the far end of the room. "Your Majesty," the messenger cried, his voice filled with urgency. A message from the north." The king rose from his seat, his expression alarmed. He took the letter from the messenger, breaking the seal. He read the message, his face growing pale. A hush fell over the ballroom. Everyone watched the king, their faces filled with anticipation and dread. The king looked up, his gaze sweeping over the assembled courtiers. "Treachery," he thundered, his voice filled with rage. "My brother, the Duke of Northwood, has raised an army against me. He claims the throne for himself. A gasp went through the crowd. Civil war. The realm was on the brink of chaos. Cecily felt a cold fear grip her heart. The king's brother, a traitor? It seemed impossible. But the evidence was there, in the king's hands. The dance of deception had taken a deadly turn. The carefully constructed facade of courtly life had crumbled, revealing the raw ambition and treachery that lay beneath. And Cecily, caught in the middle of this brewing storm, knew that her loyalty, her courage, and her bond with Sir Nicholas would be tested as never before. The glittering ballroom had become a battlefield, and the stakes were the highest imaginable. Chapter 10. The Lion's Denver. The news of the Duke of Northwood's rebellion threw the court into chaos. Fear and uncertainty gripped the nobility, as alliances shifted and loyalties were questioned. The king, enraged and betrayed, immediately began preparations for war. He summoned his council, issued orders for the raising of troops, and dispatched messengers to his loyal lords. Cecily found herself caught in the middle of the storm. Her brother, Thomas, was now a key figure in the unfolding drama. He was the Lord of Ravensshire, a strategically important holding in the north, and his loyalty was crucial to the king's cause. Sir Nicholas, as the king's most trusted commander, was tasked with leading the royal army against the rebels. He was preparing to leave for the north, to confront the duke's forces and put down the rebellion. Cecily was torn. She wanted to support her brother, to ensure his safety, but she also felt a growing loyalty to Sir Nicholas, to the king, to the realm. She knew that the duke's rebellion was a threat to the stability of the kingdom, a danger that had to be addressed. Before departing for war, Sir Nicholas sought Cecily out. He found her in the castle gardens, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with worry. "Cecily," he said, his voice gentle, "I am leaving for the north." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and reassuring. "I will return," he said, his gaze intense. "I promise you." Cecily felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear and hope. She trusted him, she believed in him, but she knew the dangers he faced. War was a cruel and unpredictable beast. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He squeezed her hand. "I will. And I will do everything in my power to protect your brother, to ensure his safety." Cecily's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He released her hand, his gaze lingering on hers. "There is something else," he said, his voice hesitant. "Something I need to tell you." He paused, his expression unreadable. I have grown to care for you, Cecily," he said, his voice low and steady. "More than I should." Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected his feelings, had felt a growing connection to him, but she had never dared to hope that he might reciprocate. I care for you too, Nicholas," she admitted, her voice trembling. He smiled, a rare and beautiful smile that transformed his face. "I know it is not the time," he said, his voice gentle, "but I needed to tell you. Before I leave." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "When I return," he whispered, "I will ask for your hand. If you will have me." Cecily felt a surge of joy, a spark of hope amidst the darkness. "I will," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. He kissed her then, a brief, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken promise. It was a moment of stolen happiness, a fleeting respite from the storm that raged around them. He departed soon after, riding out at the head of the royal army, his banner snapping in the wind. Cecily watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and fear. She remained at court, a hostage to fortune, her fate tied to the outcome of the war. She was in the lion's den, surrounded by enemies, her only protection the king's increasingly erratic favor and the memory of Sir Nicholas's promise. The days that followed were filled with anxiety and uncertainty. News from the north was scarce and unreliable, rumors spreading like wildfire through the court. Some whispered of victory, others of defeat. Cecily clung to hope, praying for Sir Nicholas's safe return, for her brother's safety, for the preservation of the realm. She found herself drawn to the chapel, seeking solace in prayer, in the quiet contemplation of faith. She spent hours there, kneeling before the altar, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She prayed for strength, for courage, for guidance. She found some measure of solace. One evening, she was summoned to the king's presence once more. He was seated at his desk, his face haggard and drawn. His eyes burned with a feverish intensity. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice hoarse, "I have received disturbing news from the north." Cecily's heart sank. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones. "My brother the Duke has won a major victory," the king continued, his voice trembling with rage. "He has defeated a large contingent of my army. Many good men are dead." Cecily felt a wave of despair wash over her. This was a disaster. The rebellion was gaining momentum. The king looked at her, his gaze piercing. "Your brother, Thomas, was he involved?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Cecily's heart pounded against her ribs. She knew that her answer could determine her fate, her brother's fate. I do not know, Your Majesty," she stammered, her voice trembling. "You must know," the king insisted, his voice rising. "You are in contact with him. You are aiding him." "No, Your Majesty," Cecily protested, her voice desperate. "I swear, I have had no contact with my brother since the tournament." The king was silent for a moment, his gaze assessing. He was clearly struggling to believe her, his trust eroded by the news of his brother's victory and the whispers of his advisors. "You will remain under close watch, Lady Cecily," he said finally, his voice cold and hard. "Your movements will be restricted. You will speak to no one without my permission." He was, in effect, placing her under house arrest. The lion's den had become a cage. Chapter 11. Scars of the Heart. Confined to her chambers, Cecily felt the walls closing in on her. The king's suspicion was a heavy burden, a constant reminder of her precarious position. She was a prisoner in her own home, her freedom curtailed, her future uncertain. The only solace she found was in the memory of Sir Nicholas's promise, in the hope of his return. Days turned into weeks, and the news from the north remained grim. The Duke of Northwood's forces continued to advance, winning victory after victory. The king grew increasingly erratic, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. The court was a tense and fearful place, everyone afraid of the king's wrath, of the impending collapse of the realm. Cecily received occasional visits from Annalise, who brought her news and whispered reassurances. Annalise was her only link to the outside world, her only source of comfort. "Nicholas is fighting bravely," Annalise told her one day, her voice low and earnest. "He has won several smaller engagements, but the Duke's army is formidable." Cecily nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and fear. She knew that Nicholas was risking his life for the king, for the realm, for her. "He sent a message," Annalise continued, her eyes shining. "He asked about you. He said he would return to you no matter what." Cecily felt a surge of emotion, a wave of hope amidst the despair. His words were a lifeline, a reminder that she was not alone, that he was fighting for her. One evening, as Cecily was pacing her chambers, she heard a commotion outside her door. Guards were shouting, their voices filled with alarm. She rushed to the door, her heart pounding against her ribs. The door burst open, and a group of guards entered, their swords drawn. They were followed by the king's chancellor, a stern-faced man with cold, calculating eyes. "Lady Cecily," the chancellor said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are accused of treason." Cecily's blood ran cold. She felt a surge of panic, a sense of impending doom. "Treason?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. But that is impossible. I have done nothing." "You have been communicating with the enemy," the chancellor said, his voice rising. "You have been aiding the Duke of Northwood, your brother's ally." Cecily's eyes widened in horror. It was a lie, a fabrication. But how could she prove her innocence? "I swear, I have not," she protested, her voice desperate. "I have had no contact with the Duke, with anyone." The chancellor held up a small, folded piece of parchment. "We have intercepted a message," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A message from you to the Duke, offering your support, promising to betray the king." Cecily stared at the parchment, her mind reeling. It was a forgery, a clever imitation of her handwriting. But it was convincing, damning. "It is a lie," she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "I did not write that. I would never betray the king." The Chancellor smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. "Your protestations are meaningless, Lady Cecily. The evidence is clear. You are a traitor, and you will be punished accordingly." He signaled to the guards. They seized Cecily, their grip rough and unyielding. She struggled, but it was useless. She was outnumbered, overpowered. They dragged her from her chambers, down the long corridors of the castle, towards the dungeons. Cecily felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She was being thrown into the darkness, condemned without a trial, her fate sealed. As they reached the entrance to the dungeons, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Sir Nicholas Warwick. He was battered and bruised, his armor dented and stained with blood. He looked weary, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "Release her," he commanded, his voice a low growl. The guards hesitated, their grip on Cecily loosening slightly. They looked to the Chancellor for guidance. The Chancellor stepped forward, his face filled with rage. "Sir Nicholas," he said, his voice trembling with anger, "you have no authority here. This woman is a traitor. She will be punished." Sir Nicholas drew his sword, the steel glinting in the torchlight. "I said, release her," he repeated, his voice deadly calm. "Or you will answer to me." The guards, intimidated by his presence, by his reputation, released Cecily. She stumbled, falling to her knees. Sir Nicholas stepped forward, sheathing his sword. He knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Cecily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. But they accuse me of treason. They have a forged letter." Sir Nicholas silenced her with a look. He turned to the Chancellor, his gaze piercing. "This woman is innocent," he said, his voice firm. "The letter is a forgery. I will prove it." He knew who was behind the forgery. The scars of the heart, the betrayals and manipulations, were not just Cecily's. They were his, too. He had enemies, powerful enemies who sought to destroy him, to use Cecily as a weapon against him. But he would not let them succeed. He would fight for her, for their future, for the truth. Chapter 12. The Serpent's Kiss. Sir Nicholas's intervention had saved Cecily from the dungeons, but it had not cleared her name. She remained under suspicion, confined to her chambers, her fate hanging in the balance. Nicholas, despite his weariness from the battle, immediately began investigating the forged letter, determined to uncover the truth and expose the culprits. He knew that the forgery was the work of his enemies, a coalition of powerful nobles who resented his influence with the king and sought to undermine his position. They were led by Lord Reginald, a cunning and ambitious man who had long coveted Nicholas's position as the king's chief advisor and military commander. Nicholas, with the help of a few trusted allies, began to gather evidence, piecing together the fragments of the conspiracy. He discovered that Lord Reginald had employed a skilled scribe, a man known for his ability to imitate any handwriting, to create the forged letter. He also found evidence that Reginald had been in secret communication with the Duke of Northwood, offering his support in exchange for power and influence. Meanwhile, Cecily remained isolated in her chambers, her only contact with the outside world through Annalise and, occasionally, Nicholas himself. He would visit her in secret, under the cover of darkness, bringing her news and reassurance. "I am close to exposing them, Cecily," he told her one night, his voice low and earnest. "I have gathered enough evidence to prove your innocence and to reveal Reginald's treachery." Cecily felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of light amidst the darkness. She trusted him, she believed in him, but she knew the dangers he faced. His enemies were powerful, and they would not hesitate to silence him. "Be careful, Nicholas," she whispered, her voice filled with concern. They will stop at nothing. He smiled, a reassuring smile that eased her fears. I will, and I will not let them harm you. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and comforting. I love you, Cecily, he said, his voice filled with emotion. And I will fight for you, for us, until my last breath. Cecily's eyes filled with tears. I love you too, Nicholas, she whispered. He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other. It was a moment of stolen happiness, a fleeting respite from the storm that raged around them. The next day, Nicholas presented his evidence to the king. He revealed Lord Reginald's treachery, his conspiracy with the Duke of Northwood, his forgery of the letter accusing Cecily of treason. The king was shocked and enraged. He had trusted Reginald, had considered him a loyal advisor. He ordered Reginald's immediate arrest and the arrest of his co-conspirators. Reginald, however, was not easily captured. He had anticipated Nicholas's move, and he had prepared for it. He had gathered his loyal men, and he was ready to fight. A battle erupted within the castle itself, a clash of swords and shields, a struggle for power and survival. Nicholas, leading the king's loyal forces, fought with courage and skill, but Reginald's men were numerous and well-armed. Cecily, confined to her chambers, could hear the sounds of the fighting, the clash of steel, the cries of men. She was terrified, fearing for Nicholas's life, for the fate of the kingdom. Suddenly, her door burst open, and a group of Reginald's men entered, their swords drawn. They were led by a man Cecily recognized, a cruel and ruthless knight known as Sir Kester, Reginald's right hand. He's the one who delivered the serpent's kiss of betrayal. Lady Cecily, Sir Kester said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. We have come to take you to your lover. Cecily's heart sank. They had captured Nicholas. They were using her as bait, a way to lure him into a trap. She stood her ground, her eyes blazing with defiance. I will not go with you, she said, her voice firm. Sir Kester chuckled. You have no choice, my lady. Come willingly, or we will drag you. He signaled to his men. They advanced, their swords glinting in the torchlight. Cecily prepared to fight, knowing that it was a hopeless battle. She would not surrender. She would not betray Nicholas. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, blocking the entrance. It was Annalise, armed with a sword she had clearly taken from a fallen guard. Leave her alone, Annalise said, her voice trembling but firm. You will not touch her. Sir Kester laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh. A woman, playing at soldier? You are no match for us. Annalise stood her ground, her eyes filled with determination. I may not be a knight, she said, her voice rising. But I am loyal to my friend, and I will defend her with my life. She charged, her sword flashing in the torchlight. She engaged Sir Kester's men, her movements surprisingly agile and skilled. She was fighting for Cecily, for her friend, for the hope of a better future. The sound echoed off the stone walls, a testament to courage, loyalty, and a bond of friendship stronger than any conspiracy. Chapter 13. A Plea for Mercy. Annalise's unexpected intervention bought Cecily precious time, but it was clear that she could not hold off Sir Kester and his men for long. She was a skilled fighter, but she was outnumbered and outmatched. Cecily, seeing her friend in danger, grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and joined the fray. She fought with a desperate ferocity, fueled by her love for Nicholas, her loyalty to Annalise, her determination to survive. The fight was chaotic and brutal. Swords clashed, men grunted, and the air filled with the scent of sweat and blood. Cecily and Annalise fought back to back, their movements surprisingly synchronized, their courage unwavering. Suddenly, a roar echoed through the corridor, followed by the thunder of approaching footsteps. Sir Nicholas, having broken free from his captors, burst into the room, his sword dripping with blood, his face a mask of fury. He charged into the fight, his movements a blur of motion. He cut down Sir Kester's men with ruthless efficiency, his skill unmatched. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of steel and fury. Sir Kester, seeing his men falling, turned to flee, but Nicholas was too quick. He intercepted him, his sword at Kester's throat. "Yield, Kester," Nicholas said, his voice a low growl.
"Or die."
Kester, his face pale with terror, dropped his sword. He was defeated, his treachery exposed. Nicholas turned to Cecily, his gaze filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Cecily nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. But Annalise was lying on the floor, her body still, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. She had been wounded, gravely wounded. Cecily rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, her heart filled with dread. She gently lifted Annalise's head, cradling her in her arms. "Annalise," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
Please be all right."
Annalise opened her eyes, her gaze weak and unfocused. She smiled faintly, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Cecily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I did it for you." Her eyes closed, and her body went limp. She was gone. Cecily felt a wave of grief wash over her, so intense that she almost collapsed. She had lost her friend, her loyal companion, her only ally besides Nicholas. Annalise had sacrificed her life for her, a selfless act of courage and devotion. Nicholas knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. He shared her grief, her sorrow. He had known Annalise, had respected her courage, her loyalty. "She was a brave woman, Cecily," he said, his voice filled with sadness. "She died a hero." Cecily nodded, her tears falling silently onto Annalise's lifeless face. She would never forget her friend, her sacrifice. The fighting within the castle had ceased. Lord Reginald had been captured, his rebellion crushed. The king, shaken but alive, ordered Reginald and his remaining conspirators to be imprisoned, awaiting trial. Cecily, numb with grief, was taken to the castle chapel, where Annalise's body had been laid out. She knelt beside her friend, praying for her soul, mourning her loss. Sir Nicholas joined her, his presence a source of comfort and strength. He understood her grief, her pain. He had lost friends in battle, had witnessed death and suffering. "She will be remembered, Cecily," he said, his voice gentle. "Her courage, her loyalty, will not be forgotten." Cecily nodded, her tears flowing freely. She knew that he was right. Annalise's memory would live on, a testament to the power of friendship, the strength of the human spirit. The king, having learned of Annalise's sacrifice, ordered a royal funeral, a tribute to her bravery and her loyalty. He also, finally, cleared Cecily's name completely, publicly acknowledging her innocence and praising her courage. Cecily, however, found little solace in the king's words. Her heart was heavy with grief, her spirit wounded. She had survived the ordeal, but she had lost a part of herself. She would never be the same. Later, after the immediate crisis had passed, Cecily stood before the king. He was no longer the imposing figure of absolute authority the rebellion had shaken him, revealing a vulnerability she had not seen before. "Lady Cecily," he began, his voice lacking its usual thunder, "Lord Reginald and his followers have confessed. Your name is cleared, your brother's safety assured, but the cost has been great." Cecily nodded, her gaze steady despite the turmoil within. "Yes, your majesty. The cost has been too great." He looked at her, a flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes. "Sir Nicholas has spoken highly of you, of your loyalty and courage, even when faced with false accusations. He has requested your hand in marriage." Cecily's heart, still heavy with grief, fluttered at the mention of Nicholas. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I am grateful for Sir Nicholas's devotion, and I return his affections. But before I can consider such a union, I must ask something of you." The king raised an eyebrow, a hint of his old imperiousness returning. "And what is that, Lady Cecily?" "Mercy, your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Mercy for those who were misled, for those who acted out of fear or desperation. Lord Reginald deserves punishment, but many followed him out of loyalty, or because they believed his lies. I ask that you show them leniency, that you temper justice with compassion. The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. It was a plea that echoed the very ideals her brother had fought for, the very principles that had placed her in such peril. It was a plea for a different kind of kingdom, a different kind of rule. Chapter 14. The Edge of the Blade. The king's decision hung in the balance. He was a man accustomed to absolute obedience, to swift and severe punishment for those who defied him. Cecily's plea for mercy challenged his very nature, his understanding of kingship. He paced his chambers, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in thought. Sir Nicholas stood silently by, watching him, his expression unreadable. Cecily remained standing before the king, her heart pounding against her ribs, her fate, and the fate of many others uncertain. Finally, the king stopped pacing and turned to face her. His gaze was intense, his expression difficult to decipher. "You ask for mercy, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice low and steady. "For those who conspired against me, who sought to overthrow my rule." Cecily nodded, her voice firm. "Yes, Your Majesty. I believe that mercy is not a weakness, but a strength. It is a sign of a just and compassionate ruler." "And what of justice?" the king asked, his voice rising slightly. "Should those who commit treason go unpunished?" "Punishment is necessary, Your Majesty," Cecily replied, her voice unwavering. "But it should be proportionate to the crime. Many of those who followed Lord Reginald were not traitors at heart. They were misled, manipulated, or coerced." She paused, her gaze meeting the king's. "I understand the need for order, for stability," she continued, her voice softer. "But true order comes not from fear, but from respect. From a belief in the fairness and justice of the ruler." The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering her plea. "Sir Nicholas," the king said finally, turning to his advisor, "what is your counsel?" Sir Nicholas stepped forward, his voice calm and respectful. "Your Majesty," he said, "I believe that Lady Cecily speaks wisely. Mercy, tempered with justice, is the best course. It will heal the wounds of this rebellion, and it will strengthen your rule." He paused, his gaze shifting to Cecily, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Lady Cecily has shown great courage and loyalty," he continued. "She has risked her life to defend your crown, to expose treachery. Her plea for mercy is not a sign of weakness, but of strength, of compassion." The king nodded slowly, his expression softening slightly. He looked at Cecily, his gaze less harsh, more understanding. "Very well, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice firm but less severe. "I will grant your request. I will show mercy to those who were misled, who acted out of fear or desperation. But Lord Reginald and his closest confidants will face the full penalty for their crimes." Cecily felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense that she almost sagged. The king had listened, he had considered her plea, and he had granted her request. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You are a wise and just ruler." The king gave a slight nod, a hint of a smile on his lips. "You may withdraw, Lady Cecily. And Sir Nicholas." Cecily and Nicholas bowed and left the king's chambers, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and hope. They had won a victory, not just for themselves, but for the many others who had been caught up in the rebellion. As they walked down the long corridor, Nicholas took Cecily's hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You were magnificent, Cecily," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You stood up to the king, you pleaded for mercy, and you prevailed." Cecily smiled, her heart filled with love for him. "We did it together, Nicholas," she said, her voice soft. "You gave me the strength, the courage, to speak my mind." He squeezed her hand. "You have always had that strength, Cecily," he said, his voice gentle. "You just needed to find it." They reached Cecily's chambers, and Nicholas paused at the door. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "The king has granted my request as well," he said, his voice low and steady. "He has given his blessing to our marriage." Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She had almost forgotten, in the midst of the turmoil, his proposal, his promise. I am honored, Nicholas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a tender smile that melted her heart. "And I am the luckiest man in the realm," he said, his voice filled with emotion. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against hers. It was a kiss of promise, of hope, of a future filled with love and happiness. But their happiness was tempered by the knowledge of the challenges that still lay ahead. The rebellion had been crushed, but the wounds it had inflicted would take time to heal. The realm was still fragile, the threat of future conflict still present. And even as they stood on the precipice of a new beginning, the edge of the blade of past betrayals and future uncertainties still glinted in the shadows, a reminder that their journey was far from over. They would face those challenges together, their love and loyalty, their strongest weapons. Chapter 15. Beyond the castle walls. The immediate threat of Lord Reginald's rebellion had passed, but the kingdom remained in a state of unease. The Duke of Northwood, though defeated, was still at large, and the scars of the conflict ran deep. The king, shaken by the betrayal of those he had trusted, remained wary and unpredictable. Cecily and Sir Nicholas, their marriage blessed by the king but postponed due to the ongoing turmoil, found themselves navigating a treacherous path. They were bound together by their love and loyalty, but they were also surrounded by enemies, by those who resented their influence and sought to undermine their position. They decided to leave the confines of the court, to travel to Ravensshire, Cecily's ancestral home. It was a strategic move, a way to consolidate their power base and to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. It was also a chance for them to escape the stifling atmosphere of the court, to find some measure of peace and privacy. Ravensshire was a vast estate, located in the rolling hills of the north. The castle, though smaller than the king's, was a formidable stronghold, its walls thick and strong, its defenses well maintained. The land was fertile and productive, the people loyal and hardworking. Cecily was welcomed home with open arms. The people of Ravensshire had long admired her courage and her compassion, and they were overjoyed to see her return, especially with Sir Nicholas by her side. Nicholas, though a stranger to the north, quickly earned the respect and loyalty of the people. He was a skilled warrior and a just leader, and he treated everyone with fairness and respect. He worked tirelessly to improve the castle's defenses, to train the local militia, and to prepare for any future threats. Cecily and Nicholas spent their days working together, planning for the future, strengthening their position. They held court, dispensing justice, resolving disputes, and listening to the concerns of the people. They were a team, their strengths complementing each other, their love and loyalty unwavering. They also found time for each other, for stolen moments of peace and happiness. They would ride together through the fields and forests, exploring the vast estate, sharing their thoughts and dreams. They would sit together by the fire in the evenings, reading, talking, or simply enjoying each other's company. One evening, as they were walking along the castle walls, overlooking the moonlit landscape, Nicholas turned to Cecily, his gaze intense. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and steady, "about the future, about our future." Cecily nodded, her heart filled with anticipation. "I believe that we should formalize our union," he said, his voice hesitant. "We should be married, Cecily. Not just in the eyes of the king, but in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the people." Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She had longed for this moment, had dreamed of it. I agree, Nicholas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled, a tender smile that melted her heart. "We will have a simple ceremony," he said, his voice gentle. "Here at Ravensshire, surrounded by our people. It will not be the grand affair we might have had at court, but it will be real. It will be ours." Cecily nodded, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "It will be perfect," she whispered. They set the date for the wedding a few weeks hence. Preparations began immediately, the castle buzzing with activity. The people of Ravensshire were overjoyed, eager to celebrate the union of their beloved lady and their respected lord. Cecily, however, felt a lingering sense of unease. She knew that their enemies were still out there, plotting and scheming. She feared that their happiness might be short-lived. One day, as she was walking through the castle gardens, she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. It was a man she did not recognize, a stranger with shifty eyes and a furtive manner. She approached him cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of a small dagger she carried concealed beneath her gown. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice firm. "And what is your business here?" The man hesitated, his gaze darting around nervously. I am a messenger," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I have a message for Sir Nicholas." Cecily's suspicions were aroused. She did not trust this man. "Give me the message," she said, her voice cold and hard. "I will deliver it to Sir Nicholas." The man hesitated again, his eyes filled with fear. "It is a private message," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I must deliver it to him personally." Cecily knew that he was lying. She sensed danger, a trap. "You will give me the message," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Or you will face the consequences." She drew her dagger, the steel glinting in the sunlight. The man, intimidated by her resolve, reluctantly handed her a small, folded piece of parchment. Cecily took the parchment, her heart pounding against her ribs. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the message. It was a warning, a threat. "Leave Ravensshire or die." It was unsigned, but Cecily knew who had sent it. Their enemies were closing in. The walls of the castle, however strong, could not protect them forever. The journey beyond the castle walls was fraught with peril, but it was a journey they had to take, together. Chapter 16. The Hunter and the Hunted. The unsigned threat confirmed Cecily's worst fears. Their enemies were not content with simply undermining their position, they wanted them dead. Leaving Ravensshire, as the message demanded, was not an option. It would be a sign of weakness, an invitation for further attacks. They had to stand their ground, to fight for their lives, for their future. Cecily immediately shared the message with Nicholas. He was enraged, but not surprised. He had expected this, had anticipated their enemy's next move. "They will not drive us from our home," he said, his voice firm, his eyes blazing with determination. "We will fight them. We will defeat them." They decided to increase security at the castle, to strengthen their defenses, and to prepare for an attack. They also decided to take a more proactive approach, to hunt down their enemies before they could strike. Nicholas, with the help of his most trusted men, began to investigate the threat, to identify the source of the message, and to uncover the details of the plot against them. He discovered that the Duke of Northwood, still at large and seeking revenge, had allied himself with a group of disgruntled nobles, former supporters of Lord Reginald, who were determined to overthrow the king and seize power. The Duke and his allies were planning a coordinated attack, a series of assassinations and uprisings designed to destabilize the realm and pave the way for a new regime. Cecily and Nicholas were among their primary targets. Knowing the danger they faced, Cecily and Nicholas decided to act swiftly and decisively. They would not wait for their enemies to strike, they would take the fight to them. They planned a daring raid, a surprise attack on the Duke's hideout, a remote fortress in the mountains north of Ravensshire. It was a risky undertaking, fraught with peril, but they knew that it was their only chance to eliminate the threat and secure their future. They gathered their forces, a small but loyal band of knights and soldiers, and prepared for the journey. Cecily, despite Nicholas's protests, insisted on accompanying them. She was not a warrior, but she was determined to stand by his side, to fight for their love, for their future. They set out under the cover of darkness, riding through the rugged terrain, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. The journey was long and arduous, the weather harsh and unforgiving. But they pressed on, their resolve unwavering. After several days of travel, they reached the Duke's fortress, a formidable stronghold perched on a steep cliff, its walls thick and strong, its defenses well manned. Nicholas divided his forces, planning a two-pronged attack. He would lead the main assault, attacking the fortress head-on, while a smaller group, led by Cecily, would infiltrate the fortress through a secret passage, a hidden tunnel that led into the heart of the stronghold. It was a dangerous plan, but it was their best hope for success. They knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were determined to fight, to win. As they prepared for the attack, Nicholas turned to Cecily, his gaze intense. "I want you to stay safe," he said, his voice filled with concern. "This is a dangerous mission, and I cannot bear the thought of losing you." Cecily smiled, her heart filled with love for him. "I will be careful," she said, her voice soft. "But I will not leave your side. We are in this together." He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other. It was a moment of stolen happiness, a fleeting respite from the storm that raged around them. The attack began at dawn. Nicholas's forces charged the fortress, their swords clashing against the defenders' shields, their battle cries echoing through the mountains. The fighting was fierce and brutal, the outcome uncertain. Cecily, leading her small group, entered the secret passage, her heart pounding against her ribs. The tunnel was dark and narrow, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. They moved slowly, cautiously, their senses on high alert. They reached the end of the tunnel, emerging into a hidden chamber within the fortress. They were behind enemy lines, in the heart of the stronghold. Their mission was to capture the Duke, to bring him to justice, and to end the threat he posed to the realm. They moved swiftly and silently, their swords drawn, their hearts filled with determination. The roles of hunter and hunted had been reversed, and Cecily, far from the sheltered life of a courtier, was now a key player in a deadly game of survival and retribution. Chapter 17. Echoes of Forgiveness. Cecily and her small band moved through the fortress, their steps silent, their senses alert. They encountered resistance, but they overcame it quickly and efficiently, their training and determination proving superior to the Duke's unprepared guards. They reached the Duke's chambers, finding him surrounded by a handful of his most loyal men. He was surprised, but not defeated. He drew his sword, his face a mask of defiance. "So, the she-wolf comes to hunt," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You will not take me alive." Cecily stepped forward, her own sword drawn, her gaze unwavering. "It is over, Duke," she said, her voice firm. "Surrender, and you will be spared." The Duke laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Spare me? You? You are a traitor, just like your brother. You deserve to die." He lunged at her, his sword flashing in the dim light. Cecily parried his attack, her movements quick and precise. She was not a trained warrior, but she had learned much from Nicholas, and she was fighting for her life, for her future. They fought, their swords clashing, their bodies straining. The Duke was a skilled swordsman, but Cecily held her own, her determination and her agility compensating for her lack of experience. Suddenly, Nicholas burst into the room, his own forces having broken through the fortress defenses. He joined the fight, his sword a blur of motion. He quickly disarmed the Duke's remaining guards, leaving the Duke alone and vulnerable. Nicholas and Cecily stood side by side, their swords pointed at the Duke. He was defeated, his rebellion crushed. "It is over," Nicholas said, his voice cold and hard. "Surrender or die." The Duke, his face pale with terror, dropped his sword. He fell to his knees, his head bowed in submission. "I surrender," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Nicholas signaled to his men. They seized the Duke, binding his hands and feet. He was their prisoner. The battle was over. The Duke's rebellion had been crushed, his threat eliminated. Cecily and Nicholas had triumphed, against all odds. They returned to Ravenhire, bringing the Duke with them as their prisoner. He would be handed over to the king to face justice for his crimes. The people of Ravenhire welcomed them home as heroes. They had defended their home, their realm, and they had emerged victorious. Cecily and Nicholas, however, were not celebrating. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally. They had faced death, had witnessed violence and suffering, and they were changed by the experience. They sought solace in each other, in their love, in their shared commitment to a better future. They spent their days resting, recovering, and planning for the days ahead. One evening, as they were sitting together by the fire, Cecily turned to Nicholas, her gaze thoughtful. "I have been thinking," she said, her voice low and steady, "about the Duke, about his rebellion." Nicholas nodded, his expression somber. "He was driven by ambition, by revenge," Cecily continued. "But he was also misguided. He believed that he was fighting for a just cause, that he was righting wrongs." "He was wrong," Nicholas said, his voice firm. "He caused much suffering, much death." "I know," Cecily said, her voice soft. "But I also believe that he deserves a chance at redemption. He deserves forgiveness." Nicholas looked at her, his expression surprised. "Forgiveness? After all he has done?" Cecily nodded. "Forgiveness is not condoning his actions," she said. "It is releasing him from the burden of his past. It is giving him a chance to change, to become a better man." She paused, her gaze searching his. "I know it is not easy," she continued, "but I believe it is the right thing to do. It is what Annalise would have wanted." Nicholas was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. He knew that Cecily was right. Forgiveness was a powerful force, a way to heal wounds, to break the cycle of violence and hatred. He thought of the echoes of battles past, of his own losses and regrets. He looked at Cecily, at her strength and compassion, and knew that her path, though difficult, was the one they should follow. "You are a remarkable woman, Cecily," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You have a kind heart, a generous spirit." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "I will support you," he said, his voice firm. "I will speak to the king. I will plead for the Duke's life. I will ask for mercy, for forgiveness." Cecily's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Nicholas," she whispered. They knew that it would not be easy, that the king might not be receptive to their plea. But they were determined to try, to fight for what they believed in. They were determined to build a future based not on revenge and retribution, but on forgiveness and reconciliation. The echoes of a brutal past could, perhaps, finally give way to a future built on understanding and compassion. Chapter 18. The Unveiling. Cecily and Nicholas returned to the royal court, bringing the captured Duke of Northwood with them. The king was pleased with their victory, with the capture of his rebellious brother, but he was also wary, his trust in those around him shaken by the recent betrayals. They presented their case to the king, pleading for mercy for the Duke, arguing that forgiveness was the best way to heal the wounds of the rebellion and to unite the realm. The king listened to them, his expression unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind a mask of royal authority. He was torn. He had always believed in swift and severe justice, in punishing those who defied him. But Cecily's words and Nicholas's unwavering support of her plea had touched him, had made him question his own beliefs. He also knew that Cecily and Nicholas were popular with the people, that their influence was growing. He could not afford to alienate them, to ignore their counsel. After much deliberation, the king announced his decision. He would not execute the Duke, as many had expected. Instead, he would banish him to a remote monastery, where he would spend the rest of his days in prayer and contemplation, stripped of his titles and his power. It was a compromise, a balance between justice and mercy. The Duke would be punished for his crimes, but he would also be given a chance at redemption, a chance to find peace and forgiveness. Cecily and Nicholas were relieved. They had achieved their goal, they had saved the Duke's life, and they had set a precedent for a more compassionate and just rule. With the rebellion finally quelled and the realm at peace, Cecily and Nicholas could finally turn their attention to their own future. They decided to proceed with their wedding, a simple ceremony at Ravensshire, as they had planned. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the sun shining down on the castle and the surrounding countryside. The people of Ravensshire had gathered to celebrate, their hearts filled with joy and anticipation. Cecily dressed in a simple gown of white silk, embroidered with silver thread. She wore no jewelry, save for the small silver locket containing her brother's portrait and the silver bracelet Nicholas had given her. She looked radiant, her beauty enhanced by her happiness, by her love for Nicholas. Nicholas waited for her at the altar of the castle chapel, his heart filled with love and anticipation. He was dressed in a simple tunic of dark blue velvet, his sword at his hip, a symbol of his strength and his commitment to protect her. The ceremony was simple but moving, the vows spoken with sincerity and emotion. Cecily and Nicholas pledged their love and loyalty to each other, promising to stand by each other through whatever challenges the future might hold. As they exchanged rings, a symbol of their eternal bond, a ray of sunlight streamed through the chapel window, illuminating them in a golden glow. It felt like a blessing, a sign of hope, a promise of a bright future. After the ceremony, they celebrated with their people, sharing a feast of roasted meats, fresh bread, and fine wine. They danced and sang, their hearts filled with joy and gratitude. As the day drew to a close, Cecily and Nicholas stood together on the castle walls, overlooking the moonlit landscape. They were husband and wife, their love and loyalty sealed by vows and witnessed by their people. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Thomas, Cecily's brother, who had returned from exile, having received a full pardon from the king. Cecily rushed to greet him, embracing him tightly, her heart filled with joy. She had not seen him in years, and she had feared that she might never see him again. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You are home." He smiled, his eyes filled with tears. "I am, Cecily," he said, his voice hoarse. "And I am so proud of you. You have shown such courage, such strength." He turned to Nicholas, extending his hand. "Sir Nicholas," he said, his voice respectful. "Thank you for protecting my sister, for loving her." Nicholas shook his hand, his grip firm. "She is my wife now, Thomas," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I will always protect her, always love her." The three of them stood together, united by bonds of family, of love, of loyalty. The past was behind them, the scars of betrayal and conflict fading. The future stretched before them, filled with hope and promise. But as the moon cast its silvery light upon them, a final unveiling occurred, not of a person, but of a truth. Thomas, looking at Nicholas and Cecily, revealed a secret he had kept for years, a secret that connected them in ways they had never imagined. "There is something you both should know," Thomas said, his voice serious. "Something my father told me on his deathbed. Nicholas, your father, and mine were close friends, closer than brothers. They fought together in many battles, saved each other's lives countless times. And they made a pact to unite their families, to join their bloodlines." Cecily and Nicholas looked at each other, stunned. This was a revelation, a twist of fate they had never anticipated. "Your father," Thomas continued, looking at Nicholas, "promised his firstborn son to my father's firstborn daughter. It was a secret arrangement, meant to strengthen the bonds between our families, to ensure peace and prosperity for our lands. The unveiling of this long-held secret cast their union in a new light, a destiny woven long ago, a bond forged in the fires of friendship and loyalty, now rekindled in their love. It was a reminder that the past, however hidden, always finds a way to shape the present. Chapter 19. A Crown of Thorns. The revelation of the long-held secret, the pact between their fathers, added another layer to Cecily and Nicholas's union. It was a destiny they had unknowingly fulfilled, a bond forged in the past, now blossoming in the present. It also, however, brought with it a new set of challenges, a new set of responsibilities. The news of their marriage and of the ancient pact spread quickly throughout the realm. It was seen by some as a sign of hope, a symbol of unity and reconciliation. But it was also seen by others as a threat, a consolidation of power that could challenge the authority of a king. The king, though he had given his blessing to their marriage, remained wary. He was still haunted by the betrayals he had suffered, and he was suspicious of any potential rivals. He summoned Cecily and Nicholas to court, ostensibly to congratulate them, but also to assess their intentions, to gauge their loyalty. They returned to the capital, leaving Thomas in charge of Ravenshire. They were greeted with a mixture of celebration and suspicion. The court was a treacherous place, filled with whispers and intrigues, and they knew that they had to be careful. The king received them in his private chambers. He was polite, even cordial, but there was a distance in his eyes, a coldness in his voice. "Lady Cecily, Sir Nicholas," he said, his voice formal. "I congratulate you on your marriage. It is a fortuitous union, one that strengthens the bonds between your two families." Cecily and Nicholas bowed, their expressions respectful. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Nicholas said, his voice firm. "We are honored by your blessing." The king nodded, his gaze shifting between them. "I have heard of the pact between your fathers," he said, his voice laced with a subtle challenge. "A pact that binds your families together, that gives you a claim to certain lands, certain titles." Cecily and Nicholas exchanged a glance. They knew what the king was implying. He was worried that they might use their combined power to challenge his rule, to claim the throne for themselves. "Your Majesty," Cecily said, her voice calm and steady. "We are loyal subjects of the crown. We have no desire to challenge your authority. Our only wish is to serve you, to serve the realm." The king was silent for a moment, his gaze assessing. He seemed to be weighing their words, trying to determine their sincerity. "I trust that is true," he said finally, his voice cold and hard. "But I will be watching you closely." He paused, his gaze shifting to Nicholas. "I have a task for you, Sir Nicholas," he said, his voice laced with a subtle threat. "A task that will test your loyalty, your commitment to the crown." He gestured towards a small, ornate box on his desk. It was the same box that had once held the king's seal, the symbol of his authority. Now it held something else, something far more dangerous. "I have received reports of unrest in the south," the king said, his voice low and steady. "A group of rebels, calling themselves the true heirs, are plotting to overthrow me. They claim to have a legitimate claim to the throne, a bloodline that predates my own." He opened the box, revealing a single, tarnished crown. It was made of silver, adorned with thorns instead of jewels. It was a symbol of suffering, of sacrifice, of a twisted claim to royalty. "This is their symbol," the king said, his voice filled with disdain. "A crown of thorns. They believe that they are the rightful rulers of this realm, that I am a usurper." He looked at Nicholas, his gaze intense. "I want you to crush them, Sir Nicholas," he said, his voice firm. "I want you to destroy this rebellion, to eliminate this threat. I want you to bring me the leader of these true heirs, dead or alive." It was a test, a challenge, a crown of thorns offered to Nicholas, a symbol of the burdens and dangers that came with loyalty and power. The king was placing their fate, their future, in their hands. It was a task that could either solidify their position or lead to their downfall. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. Nicholas accepted the king's command, knowing that it was a test of his loyalty, a challenge that could either solidify his position or lead to his downfall. He was tasked with crushing the rebellion of the true heirs, a group claiming a legitimate right to the throne, symbolized by a crown of thorns. He and Cecily left the king's presence, their hearts heavy with the weight of their new responsibility. They knew that this mission was fraught with peril, that it would test their courage, their loyalty, and their love for each other. They returned to their chambers, preparing for the journey south. They discussed the situation, weighing their options, planning their strategy. "This is a trap, Nicholas," Cecily said, her voice filled with concern. "The king is testing you, trying to eliminate you." Nicholas nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said, his voice firm, "but I have no choice. I must obey his command. I must prove my loyalty." "But what if it is a lie?" Cecily asked, her voice trembling. "What if there is no rebellion? What if the king is simply setting you up?" Nicholas was silent for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. He knew that Cecily's fears were not unfounded. The king was unpredictable, suspicious, and he had a history of betraying those who had served him loyally. "I must take that risk, Cecily," he said finally, his voice gentle. I must trust that the king is acting in good faith, that he is telling the truth. He paused, his gaze searching hers. But I will also be careful, he continued, his voice firmer. I will not blindly follow his orders. I will investigate, I will gather my own intelligence, and I will act accordingly. Cecily nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. She knew that he was right, that he had to take this risk, but she also feared for his safety, for their future. They departed for the south, accompanied by a small contingent of loyal knights and soldiers. The journey was long and arduous, the landscape bleak and unforgiving. They traveled in secrecy, avoiding major roads and settlements, gathering information from local informants. They discovered that the rebellion of the true heirs was real, but it was not as widespread or as powerful as the king had claimed. It was a small group of disgruntled nobles and their followers, led by a charismatic but misguided young man named Lord Elric, who believed that he was the rightful heir to the throne. Nicholas, instead of immediately attacking the rebels, decided to try a different approach. He sent a message to Lord Elric, requesting a meeting, a parley. He wanted to hear Elric's claims, to understand his motives, and to see if there was a way to resolve the conflict peacefully. Elric agreed to the meeting, and they met at a neutral location, a ruined abbey on the outskirts of a small village. They were both accompanied by a small guard, but they met alone, in the abbey's crumbling chapel. Elric was a young man, barely out of his teens, but he had a fiery intensity in his eyes, a conviction in his voice. He believed that he was the rightful king, that he had been wronged, that his family had been betrayed. Nicholas listened to him patiently, respectfully, allowing him to state his case. He then presented his own arguments, explaining the king's position, the need for stability and order, the dangers of civil war. They debated for hours, their voices echoing through the silent chapel. They argued about history, about law, about justice, about the very nature of kingship. Finally, Nicholas presented Elric with a choice. He could surrender and face the king's judgment, or he could continue his rebellion and face certain defeat. Elric was torn. He believed in his cause, but he also knew that he was outnumbered, outgunned. He knew that continuing the rebellion would lead to more bloodshed, more suffering. He looked at Nicholas, his gaze searching. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "Why are you not simply killing me?" Nicholas smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Because I believe that there is a better way," he said, his voice gentle. "Because I believe in forgiveness, in reconciliation. Because I believe that violence is not the answer." Elric was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. He seemed to be weighing Nicholas's words, considering his offer. Finally, he nodded, his head bowed in submission. I surrender," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I will face the king's judgment." Nicholas had achieved his goal. He had crushed the rebellion, but he had done it without bloodshed, without violence. He had used diplomacy, reason, and compassion to achieve a peaceful resolution. The reckoning of love and duty had led him not to a battlefield, but to a place of understanding, a place where enemies could find common ground. It was a victory not just for the king, but for the realm, for the future. Epilogue. Nicholas and Cecily returned to the capital, bringing Lord Elric with them as their prisoner. The king was surprised and somewhat disappointed that Nicholas had not simply killed Elric and crushed the rebellion with force. He had expected a display of ruthless efficiency, a demonstration of unwavering loyalty. But he also recognized the wisdom of Nicholas's actions. He had achieved the desired outcome, the end of the rebellion, without further bloodshed, without alienating the people of the South. He had shown mercy and compassion, qualities that the king himself often lacked. The king, after much deliberation, decided to spare Elric's life. He sentenced him to exile, stripping him of his titles and his lands, but allowing him to live. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a sign that the king was willing to learn from his past mistakes, to embrace a more just and compassionate rule. Cecily and Nicholas, their loyalty proven, their position secured, returned to Ravensshire. They were welcomed home as heroes, their actions having brought peace and stability to the realm. They ruled Ravensshire wisely and justly, their love for each other and their commitment to their people guiding their decisions. They fostered trade, encouraged agriculture, and promoted education and the arts. Ravensshire flourished under their rule, becoming a beacon of prosperity and peace. Years passed, and Cecily and Nicholas grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They had children, who inherited their parents' courage, their compassion, and their commitment to justice. The realm, too, changed. The king, influenced by Cecily and Nicholas's example, became a more just and merciful ruler. He implemented reforms, listened to the counsel of his advisors, and worked to improve the lives of his people. The memory of the rebellion, of the crown of thorns, faded, becoming a distant echo of a troubled past. The realm entered a new era, an era of peace and prosperity, an era built on the foundations of forgiveness and reconciliation. Cecily and Nicholas, in their twilight years, often sat together on the castle walls, overlooking the land they had loved and served so well. They had faced many challenges, had overcome many obstacles, but their love for each other and their commitment to justice had never wavered. They had learned that true power lay not in force or domination, but in compassion and understanding. They had learned that forgiveness was not a weakness, but a strength. They had learned that love, in the end, was the greatest force of all. And as the sun set on their lives, casting a golden glow over Ravensshire and the surrounding countryside, they knew that they had left behind a legacy of peace, a legacy of justice, a legacy of love. They had taken the crown of thorns and transformed it into a symbol of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The world was changed, not by the sword, but